Welcome back to Lifehacker Night School. This is Lesson 3, using virtual instruments. What you're looking at here is a piece that is completely played by virtual instruments. None of them are real, which in some cases sounds like it, in other cases don't. Pianos have become very realistic, I think, lately. I mean, in the last few years, or the last decade, really. Because you play on a keyboard. If you have a good source keyboard and you're capable of playing the piano fairly well, then you can get a piano sound for about $100 that's really fairly realistic. Some piano sounds are free. Some piano sounds are hundreds of dollars. It depends what you get, and if it's a 16 or 24-bit sample size. There are a lot of things to consider when picking virtual instruments. Generally speaking, though, you can find some of the best by just reading reviews. We can't possibly go into everything about choosing the best virtual instruments, but we'll talk about it a little bit here in kind of what I'm using and what I think is good. But of course, share your thoughts in the discussions if you are an expert on virtual instruments or have some that you really like, because there are plenty of people who get by with free stuff that works really well. So let's talk about what's happening here before we get into actually how to do any of this stuff. What you can see here is I have a piano track, and I have a violin track, and the rest of these are drum tracks. Normal people probably put their drums onto one track. I like to separate the different parts, the different parts of the drum kit, because then I can it makes it easier for me to see, but you don't have to do that. You can play the whole thing on one track if you like, or just play it separately and then combine them together. So the instruments I'm using is I have a plugin called Contact, which is a sampling plugin, and it comes with a huge factory library you can see right here, and you can choose from all different sorts of stuff. This is a really good way to start out your sound library. Another good option from soundsonline.com, which is East-West. They make a bunch of different samples, one of which we'll be looking at shortly. They have a collection called Colossus, and that is a very similar collection. With Contact, you get the Contact sampler, which is nice, so you can use other Contact compatible sounds and actually modify them to your needs, but you get this great factory library as well. And with Colossus, you get a bunch of, you actually get probably a slightly larger pack. Anyway, I obviously have a few other things here. One of them is acoustic piano. One is Alicia's Keys, which is just one other piano. It's Alicia Keys' piano sampled. So that's more of a selling gimmick. It just happens to be a nice, soft piano. So I'm using that here, and I have it connected to this MIDI track. And then when I play any MIDI onto this track, and it's record enabled, just like when we record enabled our audio tracks when we're recording from microphones, if I play on the keyboard, you can hear that sound's coming through with that sampled instrument. If I were to, however, switch over to the violin, which is through East-West solo violin, you'll see that instead I get a violin. And lastly, there's the drum kit, which is from TuneTrack, and this is probably one of the cheaper drum kits. It's called Easy Drummer, which it has that name because you can drop in different grooves. You can go through, and it has presets of popular drum playing, but really the kit's very good. The sample kit that it comes with, which is actually what I'm using here, is a pop rock kit. The plugin itself is, I think, about $79, and it comes with these drum tracks if you want to just kind of put in these drum loops automatically and customize them to your needs. However, the drum tracks are actually really, the drum samples are really good. So despite it being called Easy Drummer and sounds like it might be something that is for someone who doesn't want to put in a lot of realistic drum sounds, it's more for, like, being lazy. It's not. You can actually use it for good drum sounds too. So that's what's going on here, and then I have these 4 MIDI tracks responding to that. So now that you know how those are the sounds we're using, let's take a look at how we set this up. It will really depend on the DAW you're using where you find your instrument panel. Some have you add instruments in a panel like this, like Cubase does. Others will have you add actual instrument tracks where it's not a MIDI track that's connected to an instrument, but rather just an instrument track and you play. Which you can actually do that in Cubase too, but that's not the best way to do it because then you can't reuse them in multiple tracks if you wanted to. So here I have the violin, and you can see it's set to all MIDI inputs, which takes from, I have two keyboards. One is a full piano, and one of them is the little one that I use for non-piano stuff. And I have it set to play MIDI in. So you can see these 1, 2, 3 correspond to the 1, 2, 3 on the VST Instruments panel over here. And so if I go into Devices and choose VST Instruments, that's what brings that up, or, well, it takes it away if it's already open. So basically you need to add your instruments in here first, and then you can click this Edit button to show the settings panels and manipulate the instruments, load the sounds that you need, etc. And that's pretty much all you're going to be messing around with here. There are presets and other things, but for the most part, you'll just manipulate the settings to your desired effect. And as you can see, there are a lot more settings for each specific instrument than we can really get into. For the most part, you can kind of use them as they are with, and then learn a little bit about what the exact settings do, so you can kind of make them conform to your mix. Like I adjusted the reverb a little bit here on this one, but then there are also some other settings for the violin specifically that you might want to mess around with in here. It depends on whatever your instrument is. These settings change for every instrument, so you have to learn them specifically every time. It's a lot to learn about. So take it slow, concentrate on the basics first, or on single instruments, and then kind of build out that way, because it's better to get to know one instrument pretty well before you move on to the next one than to learn a little bit about each and not be able to manipulate them the way you want. So now, once you have the instruments put in, you can select them here and say, I want this track to play these. But of course, you actually have to create a MIDI track. In order to do that, you can do that by right-clicking on the side panel here, or by going to Project, Add Track, choosing MIDI, and you can add as many as you want. And then it just creates these empty MIDI tracks for you, so you can set them up like we just discussed. Right now, this is sending all MIDI inputs back out to another MIDI device. So if I played, this would actually create a loop. So if I wanted to just select Contact here, you'll see that it's now on channel 7 because it's MIDI track 7. So it just kind of assumes that. That's usually good if you're using a single device, a single sampler like Contact, and you have 7 different instruments loaded into it, and then you want to set them to, and then you want the MIDI tracks to automatically conform. However, that's a problem because there's nothing on 7. So if I start hitting the key, you can see that the MIDI track's responding, but nothing's coming out. However, if I set that to 1, where the piano is, there's a piano. So you have to make sure that you set it to the output. Now, by default, the output is going to be 1. And you can see output here is ST1. And that's where it's routed that's where the output is routed to the stereo channel in Contact, actually. And then the MIDI channel is A1. And so for the most part, you're just going to be dealing with port A. If you have multiple ports, that's a different situation, but you probably will not unless you have a complex setup. And so if you want it to go on 1, you just set it to 1. If you want it to go on 2, you'll notice now that MIDI track doesn't work until I change it back to 2. There we go. So that's how that goes. I'm going to change it back, otherwise it's going to screw up what I've got. So that way, when you play each of these instruments, you can record data in from their respective channels. So I'm just going to go over here where the song isn't, so we can test something out here. So if I wanted to play, you see nothing's recording until I hit record, but before I do that, I'm going to enable the click track down here. That's the metronome, so I can keep in time. And then you can see what my tempo is right here, which is 120 beats per minute. There goes the click track. It's kind of annoying, but that's why you can turn it off. I'm not really keeping with time there, but And you can see, though, the MIDI data is actually going in there. Now, one thing that happens is when you don't keep with time, then everything's off. The point of the metronome is you're recording a piano, and then you're recording a violin, and then you're recording drums, and more and more and more. So you want to have you want to keep in time when you record each instrument individually, because you can't play them all at once. And that way they'll actually sync up and not sound like crap. But sometimes you make mistakes like I did here. And that's where quantize can come in handy. Quantize basically takes is like a magnet for getting the beats right when they're supposed to be, and you can kind of choose what the notes are that you're doing. I mean that you want it to align to. Do you want it to align to 1/8 of a beat, a whole beat, a quarter of a beat, or 128th of a beat, which is really not aligning a whole lot at all. So you probably won't use that one very much, or even 1/64th, although I have used that. So in Cubase, you can just press Q to quantize, and you can see everything just kind of snaps in there. But what can happen when you quantize is that it sounds a little bit unrealistic, because humans play with flaws, and those flaws are what make music often sound really nice, at least when it comes to playing with virtual instruments that are not electronic. When electronic instruments, more precision doesn't necessarily mean it sounds weird. But here we go. So two things happen there. One, everything's right on the beat, so it can sound kind of unnatural because no one plays that perfectly. But also you'll see that in one case it quantized it here, in another case it quantized it a whole quarter beat later. So that is not always the result that you want. I might have wanted it here, or I might have wanted it there, but generally I would want some sort of consistency. So quantize, makes its best guess, but as you can see, this one's closer to here, and in this case I played it closer to there, to that line. So it's doing the best it can, but it doesn't always make the right decisions that you want. So when you're messing around with quantize, you can go into setup options in MIDI, under your MIDI functions, and you can set up your quantize options. But generally, I find that like if you want it quantized pretty tightly, but you want to actually make it sound a little bit more realistic, you have to play with the note positioning. Now the notes will lock to the beats that you have set here. But if you hold down the command key, which may be the control key or the option key or the Windows key, I'm not actually sure on Windows, but you can move the note freely around. You can also just turn this off, that little lock button right there, and then things will move around however you want, regardless of what you have set in your quantize settings. So the benefit of moving those things around is that you can make it sound a little bit more natural, but figure out where you want everything to align. I mean, the best thing is to just play it correctly, but realistically that doesn't happen every time. So when you need to use this, use it, but try to avoid it. But generally speaking, it helps to know like where you tend to play. If you look here, you can see where my mistakes start coming in, that I have something that is known colloquially as the honky offset, which is, I believe, it's 11 or 12 milliseconds. White people tend to play notes a little bit early for whatever reason. And you can see I'm not really doing it here, but then it starts to come into play. And the notes are instead of being right on the line, they're starting to be a little bit over the line. Now, this doesn't necessarily sound bad, but it's something you have to be aware of, that all your playing is going to be kind of like that. And sometimes you're not going to be able to quantize instruments. Like a violin, if we take a look at the violin track on here, you'll see that this has intentional overlaps and is not always on the line because it tells the instrument to blend in more. There are things that you can use to indicate to different instruments how they should play. So you don't always want it perfectly, and if I quantize the violin, it wouldn't sound right. So generally speaking, you know when you're going to play, but other instruments might not conform to exactly that. So you kind of want to keep everything consistent. If there are things you won't quantize, you'll quantize a drum kit, but you might not quantize your piano, or at least for the most part, not quantize your piano. So generally, if you're white like me, you might find yourself playing a little bit early and want to move the note just a little bit inconsistently early, leave some of them correctly on or not, and just tiny little mistakes. You want to like actually put in those little mistakes to make it sound more realistic. So that's what happens there, and then you can start recording your other instruments to make a mix together using that same methodology. It's very, very simple. It works just the same as recording audio. Once you have everything hooked up, you just kind of play it in and record. And the nice thing about MIDI data is it's so manipulatable that you can go back and make changes like we just did and fix the problems you made, and it still sounds like a good recording because you're using sampled instruments, which are really good recordings in professional studios. So that's the high advantage of these instruments. Now, for the most part, that's really all you need to worry about. Most plugins come with their own reverb and other effects. Kontakt has tons of them. If you look at the Kontakt edit panel here, you'll see that if you start going into the settings, it depends on the instrument. In this case, this isn't put right into Kontakt, but Kontakt itself has tons of little plugins. But there is ambiance and convolution reverb. You can adjust the stereo positioning of the keys, how wide it sounds when the piano's played. So, for example, if the piano's played in the middle, like it is here, then you'll hear some keys in the left channel more and other keys in the right channel more. But if you extend that spread out really wide, you'll sometimes hear only certain keys in the left channel and only certain keys in the right channel because it's spreading out that stereo width, and you want it to encompass the sound. So if you're just doing a solo piano track, sometimes that's desirable because it gives you a more dynamic, wider stereo picture when the piano's not when the piano has to take up the entire mix. But if you're using the piano in something else, you might not want it to extend everywhere because then you don't know where the piano is going to be in the mix at all times, and it can change, and that can be disruptive to the listener. So you have stuff like that. You can even add in pedal noises. Actually, I think that's here. Yeah, you can how much sustain there is, how much people hear the keys and the pedal up, which can be really nice on a actual piano only track. Like if it's just a component of a bunch of other instruments, you probably don't want the pedal noise because it's just going to muddy things up. But if it's just the piano, then it sounds more realistic because you're hearing the pedals, which would naturally get recorded. Of course, that is also a personal choice, so you don't have to have it. Anyway, that's basically how instruments work. You can add in your own effects too, just as we did with the audio track, and we'll talk more about that in the next lesson when we are actually mixing stuff. But you'll see over here in the mixer, there are some stereo tracks here. There are also MIDI tracks. You'll see these are the MIDI tracks where the MIDI data is coming through, but that audio that gets triggered from the MIDI has to be pumped into another audio track. And so when you create an instrument track, generally speaking, in most DAWs, it's pretty rare at this point that you'll find one that doesn't automatically create a stereo output for the instrument. You'll have these here. And then you can apply actual effects to these tracks specifically. So just like you did with your audio tracks, you can send it to a specific reverb plugin if you want all the reverb to be consistent with one another, which is not a bad idea. You can EQ it with the built-in EQ, or use anything that you have at your disposal in the plugin section. So you can add effects and manipulate your instruments a little bit more that way. But that's basically how instruments work. It's really not that complicated. Just to recap what we learned today, you need to create an instrument in the instruments panel and make all of the ones that you want. In some cases, like with Kontakt, where there are multiple instruments, you'll need to actually browse for the instrument you want and double-click on it in most cases to load it up into the sampler. Then choose the MIDI channel you want. For the most part, it will just go incrementally, so you don't have to worry about assigning a specific MIDI channel unless you want to. So you can assume the first instrument is 1, the second instrument is 2, third is 3, etc. Unless you delete number 2 and leave number 3, then Kontakt, for example, will fill in number 2. and so that next instrument you load will actually just go into the lowest open space. So once you have your MIDI channel set, you need to make a new MIDI track and assign it to the instrument, and then assign the MIDI channel of that instrument that you set up just a second ago. And then once you do that, you'll be able to play. And when you can play, you can also record. And that's really all there is to it. You just record what you want, keep recording different instruments, and you'll suddenly see that they all come together. In the next lesson, we'll be talking about mixing them so they don't get all muddied up, and you can actually hear a bunch of different sounds together in a nice, pleasant mix. So stay tuned. Join us again at 5 p.m. Pacific time next Tuesday when we're talking about putting the final mix together.